Good morning, my friends. Glad you're all here today. I'm excited to share another installment of our masterclass. And today I'm going to talk about the impact of stress on the human body. And I'm going to talk about the science of it. But what I'm going to ask you to listen for is what is the impact on your body? Like physiologically, what happens in your body when you feel stress or a stressor of some kind? Stress and how the human body responds to stress. Now, keep in mind how your body responds to stress, because I can talk about this generally, but I want to make sure that we personalize this to you. And I only have about 5 or 6 slides, but I think that they'll be very thought-provoking. They'll really help you identify how stress affects your body. So the first thing I want to do is I always start with some definitions. I did a Google search. I asked Dr. Google, everyone talks about that and teases about that, about tell me what stress is and how the body responds to it and so forth. So here's the Google definition. Stress is the body's and mind's reaction to a challenge or demand. So I want you to think of that. It's not just a physiological response that you might feel in your body. It can be a neurological response. It's how your mind also responds to that. So it can also be a feeling of emotion, or it can be physical tension from events that cause frustration or nervousness. So think of this. It's not uncommon. One thing that I always do is I'm kind of a touchy-feely guy. And when my patients come in, I'll often put my hand right on their shoulder. And when I touch their shoulder, I'll put my thumb right on that trap, right? Right up there on that trap. And oftentimes just a little bit of pressure, people will kind of go, oh my gosh, you hit the spot. That is a physical tension in that trap, which is likely caused from a stressor. Most of my clients are not ditch diggers. Most of my clients do not do a ton of physical work. Now, I do have contractors and I have manual laborers that are part of my family practice. But I would say that a large part of them are kind of white collar workers where they spend all their time at a desk. So that physical tension that they feel in their neck is likely not from heavy exercise. It's likely caused from stress. So isn't that interesting? It's the body or the mind's reaction to either an emotional or a physical trigger. Let's go on to the next part of this right here. So it is a state of mental tension caused by a difficult situation that can involve physical, mental, and emotional responses, such as changes in your heart rate, changes in your blood pressure, changes in your hormone levels. Oh my gosh, it's interesting that Dr. Google brings this up. Everyone kind of gets that when I feel stressed out, my heart rate might go up. We call that a palpitation. We call that nervousness. I can't tell you how many times people come in and they say, I think I'm having irregular heartbeats because I feel it. And I say, when do you feel it? They say, it's usually when I lay down at night and things are finally starting to settle down, then I feel these palpitations. That's probably a stress response. It's probably not a cardiology problem. So for example, when you stress your heart, it's during physical activity. You stress your heart, it's during heavy exercise. It's when your heart needs a lot of oxygen. You're not stressing your heart when you lay down and go to sleep. That's when your nervous system is starting to kind of perk up and you're recognizing how you feel. Blood pressure can also go up, hormone levels. Did you ever think that your hormone levels shift because of a stressor? Most people don't realize that stressors can actually change your hormone levels, right? Stressors can change women's menstrual cycle. Stressors can change men's testosterone levels. Stressors can change your cortisol levels. It can change your salt retention because that happens through the cortisol levels and many of the hormones that affect the kidneys. So while stress is often viewed as negative, like distress, it can also be positive. We call that eustress, and it can help motivate us to improve our physical or our mental performance. Kind of fun to read that. I'm going to go on and talk about a couple other things, and I'm going to drill down a little bit. So first of all, stress can be physical or emotional tension. I just explained what that emotional tension was when I put my hand on someone's shoulder and I kind of push on that trapezoid and they think, ooh, that they're kind of tight. But how about emotional tension? How would you describe emotional tension? For me, emotional tension is I get grumpy. I get frustrated. Not very long ago, my daughter came home from college and she was with us for a couple of days and she said, "Dad, are you doing okay?" And I'm like, "Yeah, why?" And she says, "I don't know, you're just not yourself. You seem more edgy, you seem more irritable." Now, at that time, I was dealing with some stressors in my practice. And it was obvious to my daughter. She knows me very well. She's been living in with me now for 25 years. She gets when I'm a little frustrated or angry or nervous. She can feel that tension. Okay. The next one is the body's reaction. I focused in on muscle tension, but I also talked about elevated heart rate. I talked about elevated blood pressure. Think of this body's reaction as a fight or flight response to a stressor, and it can have these physical changes because of the fight or flight. More and more, many of my clients are recognizing that this fight or flight response is the trigger of most of their physical symptoms. And in particular, I have patients that have autoimmune disease. So they might have rheumatoid arthritis, or they have type 1 diabetes, or they have ankylosing spondylitis, or they have Raynaud's phenomenon, Sjogren's syndrome. There's a lot of them. And I've recently, maybe in the last month or two, I've had people that come in and I say, "Hey, you're in a flare. Do you know what's causing your flare?" And many of them will say, "Yeah, I know it's stress." Let me tell you an interesting experience yesterday. One of my patients came in and she says, "Randy, I think I'm having hypoglycemic episodes." That means that she's worried she's having low blood sugar. And I say, "Why do you feel that way?" She says, "Well, I go through periods of time during the day where I'm just so bogged down, I'm so tired, and when I eat, it gets better." And I said, "What do you think's driving that?" She said, "Oh, I don't know, maybe a little bit of stress." And I said, "Well, do you have some complex things going on?" Yeah, right. She just kind of chuckled. She said, "My husband recently changed his job. He became self-employed. We had to move from our old home because we were building a new home. We had trouble closing our home loan because he went from having a stable income to self-employment. Then we moved into the new home. My daughter recently had surgery," and she just started rattling off all these things. And I thought, oh my gosh. So she's attributing these responses during the day to hypoglycemic episodes. They very well could be that. But she's also acknowledging how much stress she's feeling and how much that fight or flight response might be contributing to those challenges. So what do? We put a continuous glucose monitor on her. And I said, "Why don't you keep track of this for a couple of weeks and then give me a holler? Let me know what we find out. Maybe you are having these hypoglycemic episodes and maybe you're just trying to settle into a new normal because of all of your stressors," right? All right, my next one, perceived imbalances. Stress arise. Stress arises from this perception that you have so many demands on you and your ability to cope with that have gone south. We all hear about PTSD. The clinical definition of post-traumatic stress disorder is when your stressors overwhelm your coping skills. Now, most people think PTSD is when a soldier comes home from war and he's been exposed to bombs and gunfire and real severe problems, then he can't cope back in normal society. You know what? PTSD can happen when you lose your job. PTSD can happen when you have a fight with your spouse or with your children or with the death of a loved one. All the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder is when whatever stressor you're going through kind of overwhelms your coping skills and your coping mechanisms, and it just creates this huge lopsided imbalance in your life. Again, stressors can be negative or they can be positive. And I'm not gonna focus on this for a second, other than to say sometimes stress enhances our performance. We feel highly motivated. And the example that Google gives is a job interview or a sports event or a roller coaster ride, right? It kind of activates you. I can tell you that sometimes I feel stress when I have physicians that I'm trying to help them understand what we do to treat cognitive disorders and dementia. And then they make it personal. "That's so stupid. I can't believe you do that. I don't believe in what you do. Why do you do that? That's bogus." When I feel these, it creates some stress. And for the most part, it stimulates me to get very ambitious. So when they say those types of things, I say, well, tell me one thing I've said that you feel like is bogus. And they'll say, well, I don't understand why you're using high dose of L-methylfolate. And I'll say, well, let me get you the research. And man, I will just go to work and produce research and data to help them understand what we do. So in that regard, that type of stress actually improves my performance and helps me. The last thing, and this is the one I'm going to spend most of my time talking about today, is what is the impact of stress on you? Short bursts of stress can be very positive, but when that stressor becomes this long-term, chronic, negative mental impact on your body and on your health, man, it creates huge issues. And I look around at who's participating in our masterclass today, and my heart goes out to you because I know some of you have some really complex emotional stressors that you've been fighting for quite some time. So I want to give you a fairy tale analogy about how stress manages our bodies and how we can deal with it. So, oh, sorry, before I do that, I want to talk about the physiological response, and we're going to call that hormesis. So this is, I did a Google search from how does stress differ from hormesis? Now, that might be a big term some of you have not heard before, so I've got to define that before I get any deeper into my presentation. Stress is the body's physiological response, and hormesis is a reflection of the beneficial effects that occur when that stress is manageable. Okay? When that stress doesn't overwhelm our coping skills, when that stressor actually stimulates us to have performance, there's this hormetic effect. We call that hormesis. And hormesis usually occurs when that stress is manageable and when it's tolerable and it forces us to get a little bit stronger. You'll hear me talk about that here in just a minute. Hormesis then can have two phases. Hormesis can have a very positive phase where there's this beneficial effect. And when the dose of the stress, when the impact of the stress, when the complexities associated with that stress become overwhelming, they overwhelm our nervous system, it becomes toxic. It becomes inhibitory. It negatively affects our health. And sometimes that negative effect on health can be permanent. So when we talk about hormesis, we talk about the sweet spot. In the literature, it's called the zone, right? You're in the hormetic zone. And it's where this biological response to the stressor is appropriate. And so that our performance goes up, it's generally very favorable. But when you tip the scales, it becomes very damaging to the body and it becomes overwhelming. This is where I talk about the fairy tale of stress. You all remember the story of Goldilocks. Goldilocks is skipping through the forest. She's happy-go-lucky, and she stumbles on a house. It's the house of the three bears. And she thinks, I want to go in that house. And she goes in, and there's porridge sitting on the table. And she thinks, oh, someone prepared me lunch. How nice of them. This one's too hot. That one's too cold. But this one is just right. And after she eats, she wants to go sit down and rest her weary feet. And she comes across three chairs and she thinks, oh, this one's too little. This one's too big. This one is just right. And so she sits and she enjoys the chairs and a little rest from the forest. Well, after eating the porridge, she gets tired and she feels like she needs to take a nap. And she finds three beds. And she says, oh, how interesting. This bed is too hard. This bed is too soft. But this bed is just right. Okay? This is my fairy tale analogy of stressors. Somehow, as individuals, we have to find an opportunity to find the zone, that hormetic zone, to find the sweet spot, to make sure that stressors do not overwhelm us, but they become just right, enough to stimulate our physiology, enough to stimulate our mind, but not so aggressive that they physically, emotionally, cognitively, intellectually hurt us. They have to be just right. So there's actually a diagram that's this hormetic response to a stressor. And I'm going to spend the rest of my discussion today talking about the relationship between good and bad stress. So I've got to explain the diagram before we go any further. So going across this way, this is going across this horizontal axis. We're going to talk about the magnitude of the stressor. Maybe we could say how significant. So on this low side, there's not very much stress. On this high side, it's a massive amount of stress. Now, I haven't defined what type of stress. I'm not saying emotional or psychological or physical. I'm just saying any stressor can be kind of a low impact or a very high impact. So going across this side is the intensity and the magnitude of the stressor. My axis that's vertical going up and down is I want you to consider your body's threshold for that stress. And I drew a line right here across the middle, okay? This line is that anything below this line you can handle pretty well. You can deal with that stressor. It's not too much. It's not that significant, okay? But as it goes up, whoa, now it starts playing a little bit more role. There might be a more impact on that. We've passed a threshold. Now, I'll explain the curve here in just a minute. So now just think, let's say that I have a college exam. I have a test. I have a little bit of stress right here. So I could put that mark at this spot, just minimal. Well, that minimal physiological stress motivates me to study. I might stay up a little bit later at night. Maybe I use a little bit of caffeine in the morning so that I can memorize things and be really stimulated. I only have a couple of hours because I have other schedules that I have to do. So that stress response motivates me. And my body's response to that stressor is my mind perks up. I'm a little bit more focused. I'm paying attention. I try to dial it in. But let's say it's finals week and I have 3 or 4 finals. Now that stressor goes up. I have multiple classes I have to study for. I didn't feel like I could get it all done during the day, so I start drinking caffeine into the evening so that I can stay awake. And then late into the evening, I don't get any sleep. Now you can see that physiological response that stimulates my body, excuse me, it stimulates my body and my mind to perform. As that stressor gets more significant, as shown down here on the bottom, that curve starts to be rounded at the top. And that curve starts to say, uh-oh, I'm not doing as well as I was before. And now I'm starting to get some damaging effects from that. And at some point, I exceed my threshold, and that physiological response starts creating inflammation in my body. It changes my hormones. Maybe I'm snacking and eating junk food to try to stay awake. And so now my blood sugar goes up and I'm pre-diabetic and I didn't get any exercise. You understand the impact of this, right? So we can start to have a minimal effect on the body, and then it starts really responding and our body is performing well. When we become overwhelmed because that stressor here on the bottom gets too intense, physiologically, we don't start doing very good. And all of a sudden we have a negative impact from that stressor. Okay. This is called the hormetic zone. So where I'm moving my mouse up here, this is the sweet spot. This is where we want to make sure that if I divide this in half, right smack dab in the middle, we want to make sure that the physical response is appropriate. Now, obviously, the fault in what I'm talking about is I can control the stressor. What if I can't control the stressor? Then I just have to be aware of how it's affecting my body so I can try to aid myself in recovery as much as possible. All right. So I want to talk about, physiologically, what happens in the human body when we experience those stressors. And I'm going to go through a number of these. The first one is our body releases ROS. So do you guys know what ROS is? You heard that term before? It stands for reactive oxygen species. Sometimes it's referred to as oxidative stress. Now, there's so many models that talk about how do we define oxidative stress. I want to give you my model for teaching the lay public and my clients what reactive oxygen species is. In my automobile, when I burn fuel and gasoline, I produce exhaust. My car will produce exhaust. And my car is equipped with an entire system to capture that exhaust and transport it out of the engine. It's called a muffler. And if you get up underneath your car, you'll see that you have a catalytic converter in that muffler and those pipes that come all out of the engine block. And then the bigger the muffler is, right? Diesel engines have big mufflers or two mufflers, and those exhaust systems come out to get rid of the waste or the byproduct from that combustion engine. Reactive oxygen species are very similar, okay? Reactive oxygen species are the byproducts of metabolism. Now, those byproducts can be electrons. Those byproducts can be dysfunctional proteins. Those byproducts can be spent vitamins and minerals. Like we talk about homocysteine. Homocysteine in the human body is when the body is metabolizing methionine, which is an essential amino acid. We need that amino acid. But when the body utilizes it for physiology, for developing a physiological response in the body, we convert it to homocysteine. That's kind of a reactive oxygen species that floats around the bloodstream. The body has to learn to deal with that. We have to convert it back to methionine. We have to do something with it, right? That's reactive oxygen species. Many of you in your roadmaps, at the very beginning, this is usually on about page 4 of your roadmaps, I recommend that you take a nutritional supplement called NAC. NAC stands for N-acetylcysteine, and it is a precursor to glutathione. For many of you, when your reactive oxygen species appear to be high because homocysteine is elevated and your glutathione level is low, I will just tell you to take glutathione. Now, what's the difference in those two? Glutathione costs about 3 times as much. So I'm trying to be very sensitive to your pocketbook. I don't want you to have to spend a lot of money on a bunch of supplements. And so NAC is very inexpensive, and it's a way that our body deals with reactive oxygen species. That is a physiological response to stressors. Okay, let's do another one. So you'll see the next one is muscle strain. The analogy that I want to use is physical exercise. When you do exercise, did you realize that you actually stress the muscle to a point where there is a modest injury? There's a mild injury. This is very common in weight training or in resistance training or in bodybuilding. When I stress my muscles, let's say that I'm doing curls with my bicep. I grab a heavy weight and I'm starting to curl that weight. There's so much stress that occurs in this bicep that I create a strain. I create little micro tears. And that micro tear creation stimulates the human body to push blood flow to that muscle. That is a hormetic response. The hormetic response to exercise is increased blood flow, increased heart rate. We breathe deeper because we're trying to feed that exercised muscle more oxygen and deliver nutrients to that muscle. Well, that physiological strain oftentimes has some really nice benefits. It stimulates that muscle to grow, but that strain can be too much. Many of you may have never heard this term, but there is a condition called rhabdo or rhabdomyolysis, where when we exercise so hard and we create so much muscle injury to that tissue that our body starts breaking down that tissue without exercise. And it actually can be very dangerous. It can be a problematic response. It's called rhabdomyolysis. And I've treated 3 or 4 individuals in the last year with rhabdo in my clinic, right? Just because the physiological stress was so significant. Some of them were sick at the time that happened, and their body just converted into rhabdomyolysis. Now, how do you know if your physical activity isn't too aggressive? Well, the way you know is it's really good to break a little bit of sweat. Many of my seniors, I asked them, Did you break a sweat when you exercise? The answer is no. For many of my seniors, I'll ask them, hey, or I'll say, did you exercise? And they'll say, well, I gardened. I did laundry today. I had to clean out the garage. And my response to that is, well, when you did the laundry or you cleaned out the garage, did you break a sweat? And if the answer is no, then I often say, listen, you can kind of count that as physical activity, but I'm not sure that counts as exercise. Remember, we want to stimulate enough of a physiological response that our body has to deal with it. We want to create that hormetic response to exercise. Sweating is a hormetic response to exercise. That's how you know you got enough. Let's do another one. A stressor can actually trigger a nerve. It can stimulate a nerve impulse. I want to give you an example of this. I have a family member that experiences a little bit of anxiety. And that anxiety is most often sensed late in the evening. It's when this family member is getting ready to go to bed. And she will say to me, I get this palpitation, I get this rapid heart rate, I get twitches, almost like it's a tick, these nervous twitches and ticks. And she's described, sometimes I actually feel numbness, I feel tingling. And she'll describe all these neurological symptoms. Well, that is because the nervous system is responding to that stressor. In this case, it's probably more of an emotional or a psychological stressor. But that stress response is triggering the nerve impulses to fire. And so there is a tick, there is a twitch, there is a physiological response to that. It's not enjoyable for this person. She doesn't like it. And when it happens, she's often feeling like something else is going wrong. Oh my gosh, I'm having a heart attack. I wonder if I'm having a seizure disorder. I feel like I'm going to hypoventilate. I'm not breathing deep. The breathing becomes very shallow and very rapid. Obviously, if you're listening to this, you'll say, well, that sounds like a panic attack. But my point to that is, sure, I agree. It probably is a panic attack. It probably is anxiety. But the actual physiological stress stimulates the nervous system to have a trigger. There's actually a nerve impulse that occurs as a response to that. And I think that that's something that is poorly understood generally in the public. Let's do the next one. There can be absolute changes in blood flow. Now, for those of you who have Raynaud's phenomenon, you'll recognize that when these changes in blood flow occur, the actual tissue in the body gets super pale and super white. So I'm not going to bring up pictures of Raynaud's phenomenon, but if you were to just go to Google and you Google Raynaud's and you go to images, you'll see pictures of fingers and toes that get solid white because all the blood vessels completely clamp down. So these changes in blood flow, I think, are in part what causes changes in nerve impulse, changes in in triggers, sometimes lead to muscle strain and so forth. So you got to keep in mind that when we change blood flow, especially blood flow to the brain, there's a problem. The men don't like it when I say this, but if men have erectile dysfunction, they have poor blood flow downstairs. And if there's poor blood flow downstairs, there's likely poor blood flow upstairs. So in my book, erectile dysfunction should be a warning sign that there's blood flow problems in the brain, because those are the smallest, teeny, tiniest blood vessels in the brain. And if we have these rapid changes in blood flow that happen because of the nervous system, goodness, they might be happening in the brain. So that's also a response to a stress. Tissue damage or tissue repair. I gave you the analogy already of physical activity and physical exercise. When we do physical exercise, we create micro damages to the tissue. Like muscle tissue will have micro tears, these stressors. But that same physiological response stimulates blood flow to that tissue. Bodybuilders call that the pump. They feel like their muscles get engorged and they got really nice roly-poly muscles. That's because the body has already initiated a response to that stressor to try to repair damaged tissue. Okay. And so if you exercise really hard one day and you get sore and you go exercise the next day and the next day and the next day, there's a good chance you're going to overdo it. So we have to just be aware of that. Another really interesting thing that happens with a stressor is stressors stimulate antioxidant production in the body. Now, I already talked about reactive oxygen species at the very top. Okay. And I said when reactive oxygen species occur, the body will often turn around and respond by making antioxidants. We will make superoxide dismutase, or we will produce a nitrite superoxide. Many of you have heard about CoQ10 as a supplement. CoQ10 is actually an antioxidant, and so is glutathione. I talked about glutathione. There's a whole bunch of antioxidants. If you listen to my master class about methylene blue actually has an antioxidant impact in the human body. So what's my point here? Is that when we have big stressors for long periods of time, we actually use up and deplete our antioxidant storages. So during big stressors, it might make sense to take higher doses of antioxidants just to see how you respond to that. The next one is we activate our immune system. Our immune system can become overactive and activated. The best example of this is autoimmune disease. Autoimmune disease is when the immune system already has some sort of a dysfunctional response because our own immune system begins to attack itself. In multiple sclerosis, the immune system attacks the myelin sheaths that cover the nerves in the brain. In rheumatoid arthritis, the immune system attacks the cartilage that lines the bones of the small tissues. Same with ankylosing spondylitis. It'll affect the bones in the lower back and the sacrum. Or Raynaud's phenomenon, the oxidative response happens inside the blood vessels of our tiny blood vessels and the nervous system, right? So many of you are also familiar that when you get really stressed out, sometimes you get a cold, or maybe you get sick, right? Sometimes sickness itself is the stressor and it activates the entire immune system. And then you stay sicker longer. You just can't overcome it, right? The next thing that often happens is a blood clot. When we trigger this inflammatory response, we actually initiate the clotting cascade. And there are some actual illnesses where when the physiological stressor becomes so significant, our body starts throwing blood clots. And there's a condition called DIC. DIC stands for disseminated intravascular coagulation. I know it's a huge word. It's a medical disease wherein someone starts throwing clots and then they use all their clotting factors and they can't make a clot anymore, and then they start bleeding and they'll get a bloody nose or they'll bleed out their ears. It's just awful. I've seen this a number of times after having worked in the ICU when the body goes through such a massive physiological response and it can't control for that people go into DIC, and it's actually really tragic. The last one I want to talk about of what's the impact of these stressors is changes in neuroplasticity. Now, I want to define the term neuroplasticity. For many, many years, we taught people when you lose a nerve cell and you damage a nerve cell, you're not going to grow it back. It's gone. And so we want to protect our brain cells as much as we can. Now, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I don't want to lose any brain cells. But neuroplasticity refers to how responsive the tissues in the brain, the nervous system, the actual nerves themselves, the synapses, how much can they respond to a stressor so that they can perform better or they can grow. So for example, one of the responses to a stressor is our body produces a hormone in the brain called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Think of BDNF like miracle grow for the brain. And when BDNF is stimulated, our body becomes very plastic. Our brain starts connecting things and we create new neural networks and new cascades. It's kind of like muscle memory, if you will. You can train your brain to respond to something through this neuroplastic response so that brain function actually gets better. Now, I believe in this wholeheartedly. There are huge bodies of science that study this and learn about this and talk about this and teach this. This is why we use red light therapy. This is why we use a David Delight Pro, where you can flash a light in the eyes and you can put a stimulus in the ear. You can put some clips on your ears and send an electrical impulse up over the sensory motor cortex because neuroplasticity is real. It's freaking awesome. And we want to have enough of a stimulus to the brain that it stimulates that plasticity. One of the real challenges in cognitive impairment is when seniors feel like they're not good at a task anymore, they just quit doing that task. They'll say, well, I can't do that anymore. I've lost the ability to do it, so I'm not going to keep trying. Oh my gosh, that's such a tragedy when that happens, because when you stop using it, you lose it. You guys have all heard that term before. When you stop stimulating it, when you stop challenging it, when you stop trying to encourage that neuroplasticity, you're going to lose more and more of it. And so the body really starts atrophying and the mind atrophies and those neural connections kind of, we call it pruning neurologically. We prune those neural connections away and the brain retracts into just the things that we absolutely have to do because we're not stimulating the brain anymore. Okay? So these responses underneath the curve are actually what the physiological response is when you experience stress. And so I'm going to go back to that hormetic effect. When there is enough of a stimulus, we stimulate all of these things in very positive ways, very good ways. Reactive oxygen species actually stimulate the production of antioxidants, and it triggers our nerves to fire in a certain way. We get neuroplasticity, and it changes blood flow to the brain. Our immune system might become a little bit more activated, right? And we start repairing tissue. But when that stress is so significant, oh my gosh, it becomes very damaging. Think of how complex sundowning is in our seniors. If you have a loved one that sundowns, what's happening is that physiological stressor, whether it's emotional or physiological, stimulates all these things in a very dysfunctional way, and people lash out. They get angry, they yell, they resist their caregivers. They get so confused, they don't know north from south, and it really becomes a problem. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to talk about, if you understand this, how can you utilize this for your benefit? Okay, we just don't want to have stressors that overwhelm us. So what can we do to maximize our body's hormetic response to those stressors? So let me talk about common stressors that I recommend you employ to make your life better because you understand this stress response. The first one is physical activity. Physical activity is a stressor, but you can engage in enough physical activity that it is very stimulating and very positive for the human body. You can totally overdo it, yes, but don't overdo it. I'm not sure how I feel about people who run ultra marathons or about people who ride their bike 200 miles in a given race and they're riding as hard as they can. Am I being critical of that? No, but I'm telling you that oftentimes that stressor exceeds the body's coping mechanisms to deal with it, and they have a lot of injury, right? So just engage in physical activity. It'll help your mind, it'll help your body, it'll help your heart, it stimulates your blood vessels, it strengthens your muscles, it improves your balance. There's so many things that come when you engage in physical activity on this side of the spectrum. Okay, what's the next one? Well, everyone talks about intermittent fasting. Oh my gosh, it's the rage. We need to do intermittent fasting because it stimulates a process called autophagy and we repair broken and dysfunctional proteins in the body. It's true. Could you skip breakfast once in a while? In my roadmap, typically on about page 11, I encourage people. Oh, goodness. Was fiddling while I was talking, so I apologize about that. In my roadmap, on about page 11, I talk about diet. And I encourage people, skip breakfast once in a while. You don't have to eat every single meal. In other people, let's say that, let me give you an example of this. If you're a diabetic and your blood sugar is always elevated and you're a little bit overweight, skipping a meal once in a while is a fantastic thing. It creates a hormetic response and it's very beneficial. What if you are underweight? I have one patient currently that's 80 pounds and she's 5'8". She has celiac disease. I'm always begging her to try to find a little bit more to eat, try to figure out what we can eat during the day because she doesn't need more intermittent fasting. She's so thin. So this is relative. This response to intermittent fasting has to be personalized to the individual. But what a great opportunity to create intermittent stress that can be very hormetic in nature and create a positive benefit response. How about ketogenic dieting, right? I like ketogenic diets. I think they're actually very beneficial. One of the challenges of a ketogenic diet is they're hard to follow long term. Some people really struggle with that. But how about a ketogenic meal for 2 or 3 days? Many times when I eat dinner at night, it's very ketogenic. I'll have a nice steak and a large dinner salad, and that's all I eat. Protein and vegetables. I'm not having bread. I'm not having pasta. I'm not having fruit. I'm not eating carbohydrates that would raise my blood sugar. Ketogenic dieting is a way of mixing up your diet to create a little bit of a physiological stress response. And you might say, well, what's stressful about it? Your body has to shift from burning blood sugar to burning a ketone. That creates oxidative stress. It's a hormetic response. And when you do it for short periods of time, it can make a huge difference. Well, can you do it long term? I have had some people that have done it long term and been very, very successful with it. I would recommend you have a coach. You have someone who really understands the physiological effects of ketogenic diet that can help you through that process. Okay. The next one is sleep. Think of what happens when you don't sleep good. Sleep actually impairs your body's ability to recover from stress. If you have a lack of sleep, it's a problem. Right now, my daughter is a senior in college. She's getting her nursing degree. And she says, Dad, my capstone project is I have to work in the emergency department, and the nurse I'm shadowing works night shift. So she has to go to the night shift and then she has to come back and still do her schoolwork and take her tests and complete her assignments. It's just killing her. She says, man, I don't think I realized how negative it is for me to not get good sleep. That negatively impacts your ability to recover from stressors, and it's a negative hormetic effect. Now, interestingly enough, I don't think it's good. Like we talked about, go without eating, do intermittent fasting. I don't think it's good to go without sleep. I think that's something where most of the time we go without sleep, it's quite stressful. We need to find ways to protect that. How about psychological stress? Without naming names, many of our clients have loved ones or family members who reside in an assisted living center. That transition to the assisted living center or a nursing home was very complex. There's a lot of emotion, a lot of psychology that goes into that. Sometimes when a person goes to stay in an assisted living center, they honeymoon. And the early phases of that honeymoon is they're resentful and they're angry that they're no longer living at home. And the loved ones really have to deal with that emotional stress. Sometimes you're worried about what happens with a caregiver. Sometimes you're worried about the food. Sometimes you're worried about, are they going to administer the medicines? Some family members feel guilty about doing that. We have many people participating today who run assisted living centers. Their heart is so good. They're absolutely in the right space and they're trying to minimize these physiological stressors. I'm telling you, they're real and they have an impact on the body. How about supplements? One reason I am a huge proponent of supplements is I can tell you that the human body does not get enough vitamins and minerals from the American diet. We eat a processed food diet where the white flour is completely bleached and we're using um, pesticides and herbicides before the harvest is done that's sprayed on the food. And then we add artificial flavors and artificial coloring, and we process that food so it's nothing like its original form. I want you to think of what happens in a protein drink. That protein drink looks nothing like it did when it came from milk. It's very different when it comes from egg. If we're eating pea proteins, drinking these vegetable proteins, my gosh, it has been so processed. We need vitamin and mineral supplements. We cannot get enough vitamin B1, vitamin B9, vitamin B12. There's a current study going on in the United States. It was funded $45 million and there's 20 clinical sites. And the only intervention they're looking at is using high dose of vitamin B1 for the prevention and treatment of Alzheimer's disease. Imagine that. We need massive doses of B1, vitamin B9, vitamin B3, vitamin B12. We need magnesium and zinc and copper and selenium. We need glutathione and choline. We need vitamin D and vitamin E and omega-3s. And I'm telling you, no one on this call eats enough fish to get the omega levels that you need to have a 6:3 ratio and to keep your omega weights greater than 8%. It's just not a part of the American diet, so we need those supplements to help us formulate a good hormetic response. We need antioxidants. I had a young lady that had a terrible head injury. She was about 45 years old and a mother of three. She fell down the stairs, hit her head, ended up in the hospital, and came home, massive head injury. When she came to my clinic, she was still having post-concussive syndromes, and it had been about a month. I talked to her about what to do, and then I gave her one supplement. And this supplement was a high dose of an antioxidant, CoQ10, PQQ, and resveratrol. And she took that supplement and sent me a text message about a week later and said, that was an absolute game changer. I can't believe what a difference it made for me. And it's because that stressor of that head injury had depleted all of her antioxidants. And so all we did was replace them, and she did amazing. So I created challenges as a result of that experience that individuals who've been through massive stressors should take a high dose of glutathione or a high dose of CoQ10 or resveratrol or PQQ. And there's a number of different supplements I've used. And I'll be honest with you, people respond to all of them. It's not just one supplement that makes a difference. There are other practitioners that will say, hey, you probably shouldn't do that every day of your life. Maybe you use glutathione for a month or two and then take a break. There's some good arguments for that. So all of these should be done under the direction of someone who understands antioxidant therapies. How about massage? All of you have had a massage before where when you get the massage, you leave and you felt like you've worked out like crazy. And other times you've had a massage, maybe I'm just speaking for myself. Man, I've had massages where they hurt me. And I've had massages where I was asleep in 5 minutes. And then it ended and they're whispering in my ear, Mr. Vawdrey, it's time to wake up and take your time, get dressed. And I'm like, what? It's over? And it's because they were so relaxing. That's a good example of how we can recover from hormesis. Sauna therapy, how we recover from stressors, because massage can be part of a hormetic effect. Sauna therapy. Did you know that sauna is a stressor in the human body? Sauna creates stress. It stimulates a fever-like response. And when we stimulate a fever-like response, we also stimulate the body's immune system, the nervous system, the vascular system, the endocrine system. All of these respond to sauna therapy. There's research that shows the more that you sauna, the better your cardiovascular health. The more that you sauna, the less your risk of dementia. These have all been printed in the Journal of American Medicine. Now, I have a client listening to this discussion who purchased her own sauna, and she said, Randy, I feel so good when she did the sauna. The next time I talked to her, she says, Randy, I overdid the sauna. I did not feel very good. I was using it for long periods of time at high temperatures every single day, and I think I got a little dehydrated, and there was a couple of days I overdid it. That's a perfect example that she created this stress response and then overdid it. That hormetic response created a negative effect on her body, and she had to have a couple of days to recover from it. So I talked with her about that. Don't overdo it. Make sure you're using some salt and some electrolytes to replenish those, because that's how you make sure that you protect the body. Many of you have heard of cold plunges. This became the rage. There was a great book written by Wim Hof called What Doesn't Kill Us. Actually, it wasn't written by Wim Hof. It was written by a writer who interviewed Wim Hof. My business partner gave me this book about 5 years ago, and I bought a cold plunge. When you get into a cold plunge or you take a cold shower, oh my goodness, it's so stressful. But there's a hormetic response to that. Can you overdo it? You better believe you can. But we live in a home that's 72 degrees. And when it's cold, the heater goes on. When it's hot, the air conditioner goes on. When we're hungry, we eat. When we're, you see my point, we're always trying to keep our bodies comfortable and minimize those stressors. Maybe that's actually not so good for the human body. Did you know that medications create a stress? If you take more metformin, metformin's hard on the GI tract. Metformin blocks the use of some vitamins and minerals. If you take acid reflux medicine like proton pumps inhibitors, that can create a stress response because you're not absorbing vitamins and minerals as well as you could have. If you take methotrexate, you need high doses of folic acid. If you have a head injury, you need high doses of omega-3. Medications can create a stress response, and we have to be aware of that for the medicines that we use. If you take a statin to lower cholesterol, you better be taking CoQ10 because it depletes CoQ10, which is one of those essential antioxidants. Rest and recovery is so important. Most of us don't do enough of this. Some people do too much of it. I can't get some people off the couch. It's like their butt's glued to the couch and they're sedentary. We've got to find a balance between rest and recovery and physical activity. Did you know that hyperbaric therapy is a stress response? It creates reactive oxygen species and stimulates our body's natural antioxidant program. I'm not going to continue to talk about hyperbaric. I've given lecture series about that. I'll probably come back and revisit some of those because I've been asked to teach another continuing education course about hyperbaric oxygen therapy. It's kind of fun. Pain. Did you know that pain is a stress response and pain management affects that? Spirituality. We live in a society that separates church from state. So oftentimes in the practice of medicine, we don't ask those questions. But I want you to know that I always ask those questions. I got to make sure that my microphone is on. Yes, it's still on. I always ask those questions. Do you have a faith? Do you believe in God? How does your spirituality and your faith affect your ability to think through challenges? How do you frame your challenges? Are they strengthening you? Are they helping you? Okay. The next one I want to talk about is having a coach. I very much view myself as a health coach. Even though I'm a nurse practitioner and I prescribe medicines and I practice medicine, the reality is telemedicine is really just a big coaching session where I'm kind of guiding people and walking them through them. That oftentimes helps people have meaning behind the complexity. They feel like they can get through their complexities because that coaching experience was beneficial for them. And there's a whole slew of a million other variables that are common stressors that impact our ability to kind of balance the positive and the negative effects of stress. Okay? So with that in mind, I want to stop this and open it up for some discussion. I hope I've stimulated your mind. When you leave, today, here's my invitation. I want there to be enough stressors in your life to stimulate a positive response, but not so many stressors in your life that it overwhelms you and negatively impacts your health. If we can find that sweet spot in that hormetic zone, we often age gracefully, our hormone health is better, our physical health is better, our neurological health and cognitive health gets better, our sleep is improved, right? You have to take time to focus on these things because stress is a killer. Stress is brutal and it negatively impacts people's lives. Let me take some questions today.